Flaxborough's annual harvest festival was an affair that managed to combine, in perfect English proportion, both civic solemnity and mild intoxication. By noon, the bunting was beginning to sag. The mayor's chain had left a damp impression on his waistcoat, and the Women's Guild had run out of quiche. The centrepiece of it all was the Marrow tent, a humid, green-smelling shrine to local ambition. Within it, long rows of vegetables gleamed with improbable size and moral virtue. There were whispers that certain exhibitors had resorted to methods bordering on alchemy. One man's cucumber, it was said, had spent the night beneath an electric blanket. Mayor Godfrey Lummis, who presided over such matters with the pomp of a minor monarch, was just bending over the winning marrow when the first gasp went up. The marrow, immense and glossy as a zeppelin, had split down its middle with a wet, indecent sound. A small, pale hand, unmistakably human, slipped part way out of the rupture. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was a distant brass band playing something inappropriately jolly. Mrs. Glossop, whose capacity for shock was theatrical rather than genuine, gave a cry that suggested she had been waiting years to deliver it. Good heavens above!
There's a body in it!
In fact, as it later turned out, there wasn't. But for a full 20 seconds, the marrow's contents appeared sufficiently sinister to arrest all civic festivity. Inspector Purbright, standing just outside the tent, had been sampling a paper cup of tepid cider when the commotion began. He approached at an unhurried pace, expression mild, as though summoned to a minor administrative oversight rather than an emergency. "What seems to be the trouble?" he inquired. "The marrow," said Councillor Parkin, pointing. "It's burst."
Something inside it.
"Looks like—" "Well, see for yourself," Purbright did. What lay within was not a hand at all, but a finely made wax model of one, the kind used by tailors to display gloves. Its wrist was tied with a length of raffia ribbon, knotted neatly. There was, he noticed, a faint chemical smell. "Bleach, perhaps. Remarkable," he murmured. "Though not, I think, fatal." The crowd tittered uncertainly. Someone asked whether it was part of the judging criteria. "Hardly," snapped the mayor, his face a shade that matched the tomatoes on display.
"This is an outrage! Desecration of the festival."
Purbright's gaze drifted over the assembled faces, the flustered show secretary, Miss Teal, fluttering her scorecards, Councillor Parkin, who appeared more excited than appalled, and at the back, Sid Wilberforce, allotment holder and chronic mutterer, whose smirk was ill-timed, but genuine. "Sergeant Love," Purbright said quietly.
Best see that the tent's cleared."
"And have a word with the gentleman in the flat cap by the pumpkins," Love obeyed, shuffling through the murmuring crowd. Purbright remained behind, peering at the marrow's innards as though it might, at any moment, explain itself. Miss Teal hovered near his elbow. "It's dreadful, Inspector. Imagine smuggling something like that into a vegetable. Quite the logistical feat," Purbright said mildly. "You'd need to hollow it, conceal the object, then reseal the skin so convincingly that the judges were deceived." "Do you mean it was deliberate?" Purbright gave her a patient smile. "Accidents rarely involve wax limbs, Miss Teal." By now the vicar had arrived, offering comfort and a brief, bewildered prayer. The mayor, flushed with righteous authority, declared that the festival would proceed with dignity, as our forefathers intended, though perhaps, murmured Purbright, with slightly fewer marrows. He took one last look at the wax hand. Its fingers were curled inward, as if grasping at something long since lost. The raffia bow around the wrist was tied in a distinctly feminine knot. Careful, symmetrical, a touch ornamental. Purbright pocketed a small, torn piece of ribbon that had fallen loose, noting the faint scent of bleach. "Odd," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "One generally associates horticulture with earthier perfumes." Behind him, Sergeant Love returned, reporting that the man in the flat cap had gone off sharpish, sir. Purbright nodded. "He would. Mr. Wilberforce is not the sort to enjoy public scrutiny.
Nor, he added, glancing once more at the gutted marrow, is he the sort to bother with waxwork accessories.
Which makes me wonder who in Flaxborough is. He straightened, brushed a bit of soil from his sleeve, and turned toward the cider tent. Come along, love. Let's see if there's any left before the clergy discover it. And so the harvest festival continued, more subdued, but not entirely solemn. The brass band struck up again. Jerusalem, somewhat uncertainly, while the citizens of Flaxborough began, with quiet delight, to invent their own versions of what had just occurred. Inspector Purbright, listening to none of them, merely smiled faintly into his cider.
As if something far smaller and far stranger had just begun to germinate. By the following morning,
the Marrow incident had matured, like good gossip, into several distinct varieties. Each was cultivated by a different quarter of Flaxborough, each richer in speculation than fact. What had begun as a wax hand in a vegetable was now, depending on the teller, anything from a message from the spirit world to a coded protest by foreign agents opposed to British agriculture. At the tea shop on the High Street, Mrs. Glossop and her ally, Mrs. Vole, discoursed with grim satisfaction over seed cake. "Well,
I'm not one for superstition," Mrs. Glossop declared.
but when a thing like that happens at harvest time, well, it means something. Mark me, it's a warning." "From whom, dear?" asked Mrs. Vole, who found that vagueness gave her moral cover for any opinion. Mrs. Glossop dabbed her lips. "From up there, naturally. You can't mock the fruits of the earth without consequences." Across town, in the bar of the Swan and Trumpet, Councillor Parkin had his own theology. "Sabotage," he said, thumping his glass upon the counter. "Pure and simple. This is what happens when you let those allotment types have too much freedom. No discipline. No respect for civic order." "You're right there," murmured the landlord. "Still, it livened up the show, didn't it?" Parkin frowned.
"That's not the point, Jebson.
"We'll have the papers sniffing around again."
Last thing we need is another, what did they call it last time?"
"Flaxborough farce." The phrase pleased him less, the more it was repeated. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, had returned to his modest office at the police station, where Sergeant Love was already compiling reports that no one would ever wish to read. "Morning."
"Love," Purbright said, setting down his hat.
"I see we've not been promoted overnight." "No, sir," said Love cheerfully. "Only thing in the post was from the allotment committee. They want protection for next year's marrow entries." "Protection," mused Purbright. "From what, slugs or satire?"
"Could be both, sir." Purbright smiled faintly and sat.
For a moment he said nothing, merely turning the small scrap of raffia ribbon between his fingers. "You know," he said at last, "if one wished to make mischief in Flaxborough, one couldn't do better than to start with the vegetables. The town takes its produce rather personally." "Mr. Wilberforce came by early," Love said.
"Said he had nothing to do with any wax hands."
"Wanted to know if we were charging him." "And what did you tell him?"
"That we were investigating." "Good," said Purbright.
Keeps him worried, which may encourage him to be truthful later. Fear is an underrated aid to honesty. He placed the ribbon into a small envelope, wrote "Marrow Exhibit" in tidy capitals, and slipped it into his drawer. "It might be useful," he added softly, "though for what I can't yet imagine." Outside, the afternoon sunlight caught the red brick of the station and made it look faintly virtuous. Purbright rose and crossed to the window. Across the square, the Flaxborough Citizen Office door swung open and closed with a nervous rhythm of activity. Inside, young reporter Leonard Sellers was tapping out the first paragraph of what he hoped would be his breakthrough story. Mayor outraged by Marrow outrage pleased him enormously. He was halfway through an unverified description of ghastly remains when the editor, Mr. Riddle, looked over his spectacles. "Keep it decent, lad," Riddle said. "We sell papers, not nightmares." "Yes, sir." "But the public," interrupted Riddle, "want gossip they can discuss in church without blushing." Make it mysterious, not morbid, Sellers reluctantly removed the word grisly and substituted unfathomable. That evening, in parlours and kitchens, Flaxborough's respectable citizens replayed the event with a relish that owed nothing to accuracy. It was generally agreed that someone, most likely Wilberforce, had placed the hand in the marrow to insult the mayor. The motive was either envy, socialism, or witchcraft, depending on one's social circle. At precisely 8 o'clock, the telephone on Purbright's desk rang. Love picked it up, listened, then covered the mouthpiece.
"Is the vicar, sir?"
"He says something's been left on the church steps." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "Another vegetable?" "No, sir." "A note." "Ah," said Purbright, reaching for his coat. "The town's conscience speaks." The note, when they reached St. Mark's, lay under a stone at the base of the porch. It was written on thin blue notepaper in a delicate hand. "He knows what he did. The harvest judges are not clean. The marrow was only the beginning." "Anonymous, of course," Purbright murmured, examining the paper under the porch lamp.
"And female, I'd guess. A woman's patience, but a man's vocabulary." The vicar hovered nervously. "It's rather alarming, Inspector. I hope this isn't the start of a pattern." "Everything's a pattern if you look long enough," said Purbright mildly.
"The trick is deciding what it's a pattern of." He folded the note and slipped it into his pocket beside the ribbon. "Best lock the porch tonight, Reverend. Some people mistake devotion for confession." As they walked back toward the station, the lamplight caught the mild fog beginning to rise from the river. Flaxborough's windows glowed dimly. Behind each, perhaps a new version of the Marrow story was being refined, embroidered, and improved. "Love," Purbright said thoughtfully. "Do you recall who judged the vegetable entries?" "Mayor Lummis, sir, and Miss Teal from the Allotment Society. Also a Mrs. Mounts, but she left early with indigestion." 3 judges, 3 opinions." He smiled faintly. "A trinity never lasts long in harmony." Love frowned. "Do you think this note's about some quarrel among them?" "Possibly. Or it may simply be someone enjoying the luxury of menace." They paused at the corner where the lamplight thinned into darkness. The faint sounds of the town drifted around them, distant laughter from the pub, the soft shuffle of a cat, the hollow clang of the church clock. Purbright looked back toward the square. "You see, love, every English town has its little sins. They hide beneath charity raffles and horticultural trophies. But give them a festival and they sprout like weeds." He buttoned his coat. "Come along. Tomorrow we shall visit the mayor. I fancy his indignation may have mellowed overnight, like cider left too near the stove." And as they walked away through the quiet streets, the fog thickened, softening the lamps until they looked like small, trembling halos, appropriate perhaps for a town that so badly wished to believe itself innocent. By the time the sun had lifted the fog from the rooftops of Flaxborough, Inspector Purbright was standing before the double doors of the town hall. He disliked interviews conducted in official rooms. The surroundings made people too conscious of their dignity and too forgetful of the truth. Still, since the mayor insisted upon formal cooperation, he had decided to indulge him. Mayor Lummis received Purbright with an air of wounded ceremony. He was a large man with a complexion that seemed to have been painted on, and his chain
of office gleamed as though it had been recently polished to erase guilt.
He gestured toward a chair. "Inspector, I trust this unfortunate episode will not be exaggerated beyond proportion. We are a respectable community." "I've heard that," said Purbright mildly. The mayor stiffened. "These things have a way of growing in the telling. That reporter fellow Sellers already came sniffing round this morning. Wanted to know whether the marrow was insured." Purbright's eyebrows lifted. Was it? Good Lord, no, it was a vegetable, man. Quite so. Purbright produced his notebook. Tell me, sir, at what point did you last see the marrow intact? Lummis frowned. When we closed the tent Friday evening. It was locked until the judging on Saturday morning. Only the secretary, Miss Teal, had the key. And you, of course, as mayor? Well, yes, Lummis admitted. But I didn't go near the thing until the judging began. Ask anyone. I shall, said Purbright pleasantly. And the other judges? Miss Teal and Mrs. Mounts, both above suspicion. Indeed, though as you know, suspicion isn't a ladder, it's more like fog. It settles where it pleases. Lummis gave a short, baffled laugh. You think this was deliberate mischief, then? I think wax hands rarely grow from seeds, Purbright replied. He rose, offering his hand. Thank you, sir. You've been most clear. Outside, Sergeant Love was waiting by the car, idly tracing a finger through the condensation on the windscreen. Mayor's clean enough, Purbright said, sliding in beside him. At least clean in this matter. His conscience seems otherwise well fed. Their next call took them to the Allotment Society office, a dim little structure behind the Methodist Hall. Miss Lucilla Teal, the secretary, was found surrounded by paper forms, seed catalogues, and a large tabby cat that seemed to hold executive authority. "Oh, Inspector," she said as he entered, "I do hope this doesn't become unpleasant. The committee's already most unsettled." "I'm afraid unpleasantness is our department," said Purbright, smiling faintly. "I should like a word about the keys to the marrow tent." Miss Teal hesitated, smoothing her skirt. "Yes, well, there were two. Mine and one kept in the town hall for safety, though I was the only one to use mine. I locked up after we set the displays Friday night." "And the other key?" She looked uncertain. "It's supposed to be in the clerk's safe, but there was some confusion about that. Councillor Parkin borrowed it once last year when the tent collapsed in a gale." "Parkin again?" murmured Purbright. "He does get about." Miss Teal busied herself stacking papers. "Inspector, I can't imagine why anyone would do such a grotesque thing. It's unchristian, apart from anything else." "Motives often are," he said. "Did you notice anyone lingering near the tent after hours?" "There was that Wilberforce man, of course. He's always about, disagreeable fellow, once called the mayor a tuberous hypocrite." "A colourful critic," said Purbright. "Thank you, Miss Teal. If anything else occurs to you, even something that seems trivial, please ring me." As they left, Love whispered, "That cat looked guilty to me, sir." "Cats often do," said Purbright. "It's one of the reasons they're so popular in quiet households." Their next stop was the small terraced house of Mr. Sid Wilberforce, who met them on the doorstep in a state of preemptive indignation. "I've told everyone already," he barked. "I didn't touch no marrow. I grow cabbages. Cabbages don't need mollycoddling with wax or ribbons." Purbright regarded him mildly. "Quite so, Mr. Wilberforce. Still, you were seen near the tent late Friday." "I was fetching me spade. Left it by the fence after the weigh-in. Can't have a man forget his own tools now, can you?" "Of course not. Did you see anyone else there?" Wilberforce frowned. "Maybe that reporter lad, Sellers. He's always sneaking about, thinking everyone's hiding a scandal." "Was he carrying anything?" "Notebook, pencil, and a face that needed a slap." Purbright gave a courteous nod. "That will do nicely, thank you. We shan't trouble you further, at least not until we know more about the marrow's internal anatomy." As they drove away, Love said, "That one's got temper enough for mischief." "True," said Purbright, "but temper seldom expresses itself through waxwork. It prefers hammers." The afternoon waned into one of those reluctant autumn twilights that smell faintly of smoke and damp earth. Purbright and Love sat once more in the station office, their notes spread before them like the remains of an incomplete jigsaw. So far, said Love, we've got a mayor who's outraged, a secretary who's nervous, and a cabbage man who's rude. Plus a reporter with ambitions and access to tents, Purbright added. If this were fiction, we'd soon have a confession. Fortunately, it isn't. He leaned back, gazing at the ceiling. You notice anything curious, Love? Only that everyone blames someone else. Exactly. A sure sign they all feel a little guilty. He paused, eyes half closed. The marrow was tampered with after it was displayed. That means someone with both opportunity and patience. Perhaps even pride. Love looked puzzled. Pride, sir? Indeed. One doesn't insert a wax hand into a vegetable without some sense of artistry. At that moment, the telephone rang again. Love answered, nodded, and passed it to Purbright. Miss Teal, sir. She says she's remembered something. Purbright listened for a minute, then replaced the receiver. Interesting, he said. What's that? She recalls lending her key to Councillor Parkin last Tuesday. He said it was to check the new canvas seams. She thought nothing of it. Love blinked. Parkin again? Yes, Purbright murmured. A man of civic enthusiasm. It seems our vegetables have more politics in them than vitamins. He rose, collecting his hat. Tomorrow we shall see what Councillor Parkin was really patching up. For now, let's hope the town sleeps quietly. It's exhausting to be scandalous. Outside, the gas lamps flickered to life one by one, glinting off the river like slow thoughts taking shape. Somewhere, a church bell tolled 9, steady as conscience, and behind his calm expression, Inspector Purbright was already turning over the small, fragrant puzzle that had begun, so politely, in a burst of marrow. By morning, the rumour mill had refined its energies into a single conviction. Councillor Parkin was certain that Sid Wilberforce, the cabbage man with the permanent grievance, was behind the marrow outrage. It was, he declared loudly to anyone within a 3-yard radius, an act of pure spite against civic dignity. The conclusion was convenient, and in Flaxborough, convenience often masqueraded as evidence. Inspector Purbright, however, did not share the enthusiasm. He and Sergeant Love called at Wilberforce's cottage again, this time armed with a search warrant discreet enough to seem like an invitation. Wilberforce met them with the look of a man who'd spent the night composing new insults for authority.
Back again, are you?
Thought you'd have better crimes to worry about. Burglars, murderers, them council expense fiddlers. Purbright smiled mildly.
Oh, we have plenty of those.
But we mustn't neglect the moral welfare of vegetables, must we?
May we come in?
Wilberforce muttered something about state interference, and led them into a sitting room that smelled strongly of paraffin and cabbage water. Every surface held some token of self-sufficiency, jars of pickles, garden implements, a framed certificate for Best Green Beans 1959. Purbright's eyes wandered without appearing to. Fine collection, Mr. Wilberforce. You've a gift for cultivation. I just do things proper, Wilberforce said.
Not like that mayor's lot.
Think because they've got a sash and a title, they can tell me how to grow what I've been growing since before they were born. Ah, yes, Purbright said softly.
You've had words with the mayor, haven't you? Aye, and I'll have 'em again if he starts meddling with my allotment water supply.
Threatened to fine me for using my own hose. Harsh treatment indeed. Purbright's gaze drifted to a small table by the window. Upon it lay a pair of gardening shears, freshly cleaned. You keep your tools in excellent condition, I see. Wilberforce followed his glance. That's because I don't waste time sitting in council meetings polishing my ego. Purbright gave a mild chuckle, the kind that could be mistaken for sympathy. Tell me, Mr. Wilberforce, where were you Friday evening, say between 7 and 9? Wilberforce folded his arms. At home. Had me supper, read the paper, turned in by 10. Anyone see you?
Only my cat, and she don't talk to police. Purbright nodded as though the answer were perfectly sufficient.
And you didn't happen to stroll by the showground after dark? No, I did not.
And if I had, I wouldn't waste my time poking wax hands into marrows. Purbright tilted his head, smiling faintly.
A fair point. Waxwork doesn't seem your medium. Still, one must be thorough. The search turned up nothing of interest. No wax, no ribbons, and certainly no evidence of artistry. When they left, Wilberforce stood in his doorway, arms folded, glaring after them with the expression of a man already rehearsing his complaints to the local paper. Back at the station, Love frowned over his notes. If he's guilty, sir, he's doing a good job pretending he's not. Indeed, said Purbright. Though in Flaxborough, outrage is practically a form of innocence. Still, the town prefers a culprit, and he fits comfortably. Should we let the mayor know we've cleared him? Purbright smiled. Oh, not yet. It would be cruel to deprive them of speculation so soon. Gossip is how this place digests fear. He leaned back, steepling his fingers.
What troubles me, love, is how carefully the act was done.
The marrow's skin had been resealed so neatly that no one noticed until it burst. Whoever managed that wasn't acting on impulse. It took patience and access, meaning someone familiar with the exhibit tent, the display rules, and the mayor's habits. Someone respectable enough not to be questioned when they lingered. Love blinked. Miss Teal? Purbright's smile deepened. She had opportunity, yes. But motive? She seems devoted to her marrows, maybe too devoted, Love ventured. Possibly. Though I suspect her secret sins would run more to petticoat envy than horticultural subversion. The telephone rang again. Love picked up and handed it to Purbright.
Councillor Parkin, sir. Ah, said Purbright.
Our self-appointed conscience. He lifted the receiver. Good morning, Councillor. How comforting to know you're alert so early. Parkin's voice emerged sharp and self-satisfied. Inspector, I hope you're pursuing this Wilberforce business vigorously. The council demands results. Results, Purbright echoed. Fine word, Councillor. So full of moral fragrance. Tell me, how fares your canvas repair work these days? There was a pause.
What, the show tent?
Perfectly fine, perfectly fine.
Why do you ask?
I'm fond of craftsmanship, said Purbright blandly. One hears you borrowed the key last week. I wondered whether you noticed anything.
Unusual, another pause, shorter this time.
Nothing of the kind. Look, Inspector, I can't stand here gossiping. Important meeting. Of course, Purbright said, and replaced the receiver with care. He sat for a moment, silent. Then, almost to himself, he murmured, When men hurry away from innocent questions, it's generally because the answers are too trivial to tell truthfully. Love blinked.
You think Parkin's mixed up in it?
I think Parkin is incapable of resisting attention, said Purbright. But whether that leads to crime or merely bad taste remains to be seen. He rose, stretching. Still, for the sake of tidiness, we'll let the town believe Wilberforce is their villain for a day or two.
It may loosen other tongues. That afternoon, as word spread that the police had their man, the mood in Flaxborough became almost festive.
The tea shop was abuzz, the mayor reappeared in public, and Mrs. Glossop assured everyone that she had always suspected Wilberforce of something unwholesome. Purbright, walking home beneath the mellow evening sky, paused at the edge of the square. Through the misted window of the Flaxborough Citizen, he saw young Sellers arguing with his editor, waving a sheet of paper triumphantly. The headline, already penciled large, read, Local man to be questioned in Marrow affair. Purbright smiled faintly, then continued on, his hands deep in his coat pockets. He had no intention of charging Wilberforce yet. The story was too neat, too quick, like a path freshly swept to conceal where the footprints led. And as the gaslights flickered to life along the cobbled street, he wondered, not for the first time, why the Marrow's raffia ribbon had smelled faintly of bleach. A practical joke, yes, but whose idea of practical involved cleaning fluid and wax? The thought stayed with him as he reached his small house and switched on the single lamp. Flaxborough was settling into its evening habits, curtains drawn, kettles on, gossip simmering gently. But somewhere, Purbright felt, someone was waiting uneasily, unsure whether to feel clever or frightened. The marrow had burst. Now, sooner or later, the truth would have to do the same. The morning after Wilberforce's public condemnation dawned with a deceptive tranquility. The town square was washed clean by a night of rain, and the bunting, sodden but defiant, hung limp across the empty stalls. It was there, near the now deserted marrow tent, that a young constable named Briggs discovered something the weather had failed to wash away. He brought it to Inspector Purbright with an air of accomplishment, as if personally responsible for fate's timing. "Found this, sir?"
Caught under one of the tent ropes.
"Must have been missed when they cleared up." Purbright examined the item, a small pin badge shaped like a sheaf of wheat, the sort one might wear at harvest services or civic events. Its gilt surface was dulled, but a faint trace of something chalky clung to the clasp. "Where exactly?" Purbright asked. "Near the back entrance of the tent, sir, where the canvas tore." Purbright turned the pin over in his fingers. "Recognize it?" Briggs shook his head. "Looks churchy, maybe. Or Women's Guild." Purbright gave a thoughtful hum and slipped the pin into his pocket. "Thank you, Briggs. You may have just complicated an entire town's satisfaction." When Sergeant Love arrived moments later, Purbright was already polishing the badge with his handkerchief.
"Another trinket from our little vegetable mystery," he said.
"See here, the clasp is bent as if torn off in haste."
"And there's that smell again. Bleach." Love wrinkled his nose.
"Someone's been cleaning up after themselves." "Or trying to," said Purbright. "The trouble with guilt, Love, is that it's seldom tidy. It leaves its polish marks everywhere." They decided to trace the badge's origin, a task that required less detective skill than patience. Within an hour, they were seated in the anteroom of St. Mark's Church, listening to the earnest recollections of Miss Caldecott,
leader of the parish committee and guardian of its memorabilia. "Oh, yes. Inspector," she said, adjusting her spectacles.
"Those pins were distributed last year for the Harvest Thanksgiving appeal."
"Only to the committee, mind you. I still have the list somewhere. Oh, where did I put it?"
Purbright waited with the serenity of a man who understood that bureaucratic archaeology could not be hurried. Finally, a folded ledger appeared. Miss Caldecott ran a careful finger down its columns. "There we are. Mrs. Mounts, Councillor Parkin, Miss Teal, and—" "Reverend Pettifer, of course." Purbright's eyebrows rose slightly. "Mrs. Mounts, the horticultural judge who left early with indigestion?"
"Yes, poor woman. Very delicate digestion," she says.
"Though I sometimes wonder if it's sympathy pains from her husband's cooking. Do you recall her wearing this pin?" "Oh, yes, always. Said it made her feel properly grateful, whatever that means." "She lost it last month, though, and insisted someone had taken it." Purbright's smile flickered faintly. How observant of her. Did she happen to mention where she might have lost it?
"At the allotment committee meeting, I believe." "Of course," murmured Purbright.
The soil of every scandal in Flaxborough. As they walked back through the drizzle, Love said, "So the pin could have been Mrs. Mounts's. Maybe it fell when she was judging." "Perhaps," said Purbright, "but she claimed it was stolen weeks ago." "People who lie about small losses often fear questions about larger ones." "Meaning she's our prankster?" Purbright gave a small shake of the head. "No, Love, but she may have brushed against whoever is." By afternoon, they called at the Mounts' residence, a neat, semi-detached house whose front garden bore more gnomes than seemed strictly moral. Mrs. Mounts herself was plump.
"Pink-faced and perpetually astonished by life, Inspector,"
she said, ushering them in as though they were delivering a prize.
"Oh, I've been expecting you."
"I told my husband you'd want to know all about that horrid vegetable." Purbright smiled politely. "Yes, the marrow does seem to have acquired a lively afterlife. You left the festival rather early, I believe?" "Oh, dear me, yes. The excitement quite overcame me. I had a dreadful fluttering. My doctor says my constitution isn't designed for surprises." "Of course. And yet you seem quite well today." "Rest and bicarbonate," she said proudly. "Cures everything." Purbright's gaze drifted to her lapel.
I notice you're not wearing your harvest pin today. Her expression changed. A flicker quickly smoothed over.
Lost it ages ago, Inspector.
I was furious. I thought Miss Teal might have picked it up by mistake, but she swore not. Did you mention it to anyone else?
Oh, perhaps to Councillor Parkin. He's always so sympathetic. Sympathetic, repeated Purbright softly.
How very public-spirited of him. He rose, adjusting his hat.
Thank you, Mrs. Mounts. You've been most helpful. Try to avoid excitement for a few days, though in Flaxborough that shouldn't be difficult. Outside, Love exhaled into the damp air. You think Parkin's got his fingers in all this, don't you, sir? I think, said Purbright, he's acquired too many confidences for an honest man. They walked in silence until they reached the police car. Purbright drew the badge from his pocket, studying it once more. Strange, isn't it, Love? A bit of gilt and tin, worth nothing really, yet it may tie together half the town's secrets, Love frowned. But what connects it to the marrow? Purbright slipped the badge back into its envelope. Someone tried very hard to clean it, to hide its scent. That tells me it was handled after the incident, which means whoever wore it returned to the scene, perhaps to make sure their work was admired. Love looked startled. You mean the person wanted it found? Possibly, said Purbright. Vanity is a lonely crime, Love. It likes an audience, even a small one. They drove back through streets slick with rain, past shuttered shops and gossiping curtains. Flaxborough's surface calm was deceptive. Beneath it, something faintly acrid hung in the air, like bleach that had not quite been rinsed away. Purbright's hand rested on the envelope in his pocket. A pin, a marrow, a ribbon, he murmured. Small things, but small things are the only ones people truly guard. And when they lose them, they tell you who they are. Love gave him a puzzled glance. So what do we do next? Purbright's smiled eyes half-lidded against the drizzle. Wait, Love. The guilty, like bad gardeners, can't resist revisiting their handiwork. The car's wipers beat slowly, rhythmically, as if marking time for the confession that had not yet been spoken. Somewhere beyond the grey rooftops, a church bell chimed 6, soft, measured, and faintly ironic. And in that sound, Purbright heard the whisper of a mind too proud to let its secret rot quietly in the soil. By Wednesday, the Marrow affair had ceased to be merely scandalous and begun to assume the proportions of folklore. There was already an embroidered version circulating that involved witchcraft, moonlight, and a buried curse. Another held that it was all a publicity stunt organized by the mayor to modernize the festival. The only person in Flaxborough who seemed not to have an opinion was Inspector Purbright himself, which made him, in local eyes, the most suspicious man of all. He sat that morning in his office with the small harvest pin laid neatly on a sheet of blotting paper. It caught the grey light like a faint glint of conscience. Sergeant Love, opposite him, was staring glumly at a copy of the Flaxborough Citizen. "They've printed the mayor's speech, sir," Love said. "The Marrow affair will not tarnish our civic spirit." "Ah," murmured Purbright. "A comforting slogan, if you're the spirit in question." He reached for the envelope that contained the anonymous note left on the church steps and placed it beside the badge. "A message and a symbol," he said quietly. "The trouble with morality, Love, is that it's often left lying about where anyone can trip over it." A discreet knock came at the door, and in stepped Leonard Sellers, the young reporter whose ambition exceeded his sense of timing. His notebook bulged with both facts and approximations. "Morning, Inspector," he said brightly. "I thought you might like to clarify a few details for the next edition." "How considerate," Purbright said. "We do so dislike clarity here, but perhaps I can indulge you." Sellers flushed but pressed on. "People are saying you found evidence linking the incident to the allotment committee." "People," Purbright said, "are an inexhaustible source of invention." "Do go on. Also," said Sellers, "that you're about to charge someone. Mr. Wilberforce, I suppose?" Purbright smiled faintly. Mr. Wilberforce's sole offence thus far is candour.
If we ever decide to prosecute honesty, he'll be the first in the dock. Sellers hesitated. You think someone else is involved?
I think, Purbright replied, the truth in Flaxborough is like jam. It sticks to whoever last handled it. The young man scribbled the line down eagerly, misquoting it in the process. As he left, Love gave a sigh of relief. He'll have half the town confessing by supper. Quite possibly, said Purbright. Still, even nonsense has its uses. It keeps the guilty from dozing. That afternoon, Purbright paid a visit to Reverend Pettifer at St. Mark's Vicarage. The vicar greeted him warmly, though his smile had the strained politeness of a man who suspects theology may not be sufficient armour. Inspector, still occupied with that dreadful affair?
I do wish it hadn't happened during harvest. I imagine the Almighty is used to agricultural mischief, Purbright said mildly.
Tell me, Reverend, do you recall seeing anyone near the church the night before the festival? The vicar frowned. Only Miss Teal. She was arranging flowers quite late. Diligent woman, though rather earnest. She mentioned she'd had a quarrel with Councillor Parkin earlier that day about the floral display budget. Something about the moral worth of chrysanthemums. I tried to follow, but theology is simpler. Purbright nodded.
And did she seem upset?
She was muttering about men who think gratitude can be bought with silver cups. I assumed she meant the prizes. Most likely, said Purbright. But gratitude, Reverend, is a more expensive currency than silver. As he left, the vicar's housekeeper intercepted him in the hall. Beg pardon, sir, she said, lowering her voice, but I saw Miss Teal that night too. She came back later, after dark, said she'd forgotten her gloves, but she was carrying something in a brown paper parcel, and it weren't gloves, I'll swear. Thank you, Purbright said. If your conscience feels overstocked, do send me the surplus. Back at the station, Love looked up from his paperwork as Purbright entered. Anything from the vicar, sir? Only reassurance that Sin remains well organised. He paused. Miss Teal's alibi is becoming rather ornate. We'll call on her again tomorrow. For now, I'd like a quiet word with Councillor Parkin. Parkin, summoned to the station, arrived with the brisk indignation of a man whose schedule was composed entirely of civic importance. This is really quite irregular, Inspector, he said. I've already given my statement. Indeed, said Purbright. But statements, like vegetables, sometimes benefit from a little pruning. You borrowed a key to the marrow tent last week, did you not? Yes, to inspect the seams.
I told you that. Quite. And you returned it? Of course. Directly to Miss Teal.
Parkin hesitated.
Yes, directly. Purbright watched him for a moment, his gaze calm but unblinking.
You're certain? Parkin shifted slightly. Well,
it's possible I left it on her desk.
But really, Inspector, this is nonsense.
I'm a public servant. Public service, Purbright said pleasantly, is a curious thing.
It often involves locking doors one shouldn't open. Parkin rose abruptly.
I won't be slandered.
You'll hear from my solicitor if this continues. I look forward to his views, said Purbright, without moving. They may prove as enlightening as yours. When he'd gone, Love emerged from behind the filing cabinet, where he'd been pretending to type.
Touchy, isn't he?
Guilt often is, Purbright said, though not necessarily of crime. The next morning brought a fresh ripple through Flaxborough's composure. Miss Teal was seen walking hurriedly toward the railway station, a small suitcase in hand. The porter said she'd asked about the next train to Lincoln but had not boarded it. She had, however, left the case behind. It contained, beneath an ordinary layer of clothes and gloves, a half-used bottle of household bleach, several torn pieces of raffia ribbon, and an envelope addressed, though never posted, to Councillor Parkin. Purbright examined the contents in silence. Love finally spoke. Well, that looks like a confession, sir. Or a conversation she decided not to finish, said Purbright quietly. Notice the handwriting, hesitant, like someone who's trying to write truth without quite admitting it. He turned the bottle in his hand, then replaced it carefully. I think Miss Teal has been tidying someone else's mess, not her own. Love frowned.
Then whose?
Purbright gave a small, dry smile. The kind of person who mistakes influence for immunity. Someone with charm enough to make others clean after him. He glanced at the clock. Let's pay a visit to the Swan and Trumpet this evening. I have a feeling Councillor Parkin will be holding court there as usual. People who fear exposure often retreat to applause. The rain had stopped by dusk, leaving the streets shining like pewter. From the pub windows came the hum of laughter and the clink of glasses. Inside, Parkin stood at the bar, surrounded by admirers, declaring the Marrow incident practically solved. Purbright stepped up beside him, ordering cider. Parkin faltered mid-sentence, his smile freezing. "Evening, Councillor," Purbright said softly.
I see you're still nurturing civic unity, Parkin forced a laugh.
"One must keep up morale, Inspector, of course."
Especially when morale begins to wilt. Purbright sipped his cider, his eyes never leaving the man beside him.
He could almost smell the faint trace of bleach beneath the tavern's smoke and hops, a scent that, once noticed, refused to be ignored. By the time he left, Parkin's laughter had turned brittle, the way glass sounds just before it cracks. Purbright walked back into the cool night, his thoughts quietly assembling. The field at last had begun to widen, and somewhere in that well-tended garden of respectability, he knew something poisonous was preparing to bloom. The next morning brought a peculiar quiet to Flaxborough, a sort of collective holding of breath, as though the town, having gorged itself on scandal, was pausing to digest. But Purbright had long since learned that silence in Flaxborough never meant peace. It was merely the hush before the next round of revelations, each tidier than the last, but somehow less believable. He was still contemplating this when Sergeant Love appeared in the doorway, cap in hand and worry on his face. "Message from the Swan and Trumpet, sir. Councillor Parkin's been found in the cider tent behind the showground. Alive?" "Barely, sir. The landlord says he was lying there among the barrels, white as milk and stinking of bleach." Purbright set down his pen and rose. "Ah," he said quietly. "The harvest continues." The cider tent, though cleared of the festival crowds, still smelled of apples and spilt bravado. Parkin sat propped in a chair, a towel round his shoulders, and a complexion suggesting both indignation and gastric distress. The doctor, a small harried man with nicotine-stained fingers, was just packing up his case. "He'll live," the doctor muttered. "Though if self-importance were a poison, I'd not give him an hour." Purbright inclined his head.
"Thank you, Doctor. I shall try to keep him alive long enough to explain himself." When they were alone, Parkin glared up with a mix of outrage and embarrassment. "I was assaulted, Inspector. A cowardly attack."
"Indeed, by whom?" I don't know. I came here early to inspect the clean-up. Something struck me from behind." "Ah." Purbright's gaze drifted to the overturned mug beside the chair.
"And this smell of bleach, does that strike you as familiar too?"
Parkin hesitated. Perhaps they meant to disguise the scent of liquor. "Flaxborough criminals are rarely that considerate," Purbright said. "Tell me, Councillor, were you expecting anyone?" Parkin adjusted the towel defensively. "Miss Teal asked to meet me, actually. Said she'd found something important. And she didn't arrive?"
"No, unless she did after I—" He trailed off, frowning.
"Wait, there was a sound behind me just before I blacked out. Something like cloth tearing. Canvas, perhaps?" Purbright suggested. Parkin nodded uncertainly. "Yes, that's it, canvas." Purbright's expression gave away nothing. "You've had a fortunate escape, Councillor. Whoever interrupted your inspection may not have meant only embarrassment." The remark left Parkin pale again. As Purbright turned to leave, the councillor called after him, "You don't believe that Teal woman? She wouldn't—" Purbright paused at the tent flap. "Belief is an expensive hobby, Councillor. I prefer evidence." Outside, Love was waiting beside the police car. "If you ask me, sir, Parkin did that to himself." "How so?" "He's the sort who'd faint from the smell of his own vanity. Maybe knocked over the jug, made a mess, and blamed the nearest skirt." Purbright smiled faintly. A persuasive theory, but there's one problem. Parkin doesn't clean. The bleach suggests another hand. They drove next to Miss Teal's cottage, where the curtains were drawn despite the morning sun. The door opened only halfway, revealing her pale face, its usual precision of expression replaced by something more fragile. "Inspector," she said quickly, "if this is about Councillor Parkin, I've already heard."
I had nothing to do with it. Purbright inclined his head. I see.
"Then perhaps you could tell me what you were planning to discuss with him in the cider tent."
Her eyes widened slightly, then she looked down.
"He asked me to meet him, not the other way around. Said he wanted to resolve matters amicably. I didn't go. Why not?" "Because I changed my mind," she said. "I realized he was only interested in silencing me." "Silencing you about what?" Her hand tightened on the doorframe. "You'll think it's silly." "I rarely do," said Purbright. She hesitated, then spoke softly. "The wax hand, it wasn't meant for the mayor at all. It was meant for Parkin." "Indeed?"
It was a message, she continued.
"Someone wanted to remind him that the Harvest Committee's accounts were not as pure as they seemed. I think he's been pocketing donations." Purbright regarded her with quiet interest.
And who might know enough to send such a reminder? I don't know, she whispered.
"But I think Mrs. Mount suspects something too. She came to see me the night after the festival. She was frightened. Said she'd overheard Parkin and the mayor arguing about a receipt book. Then she begged me not to tell anyone." "Receipt book," Purbright repeated thoughtfully.
How enterprising of Flaxborough's clergy to outsource confession. She looked stricken.
"You won't tell him I said this, will you? He's powerful here." "Miss Teal," Purbright said gently. "In my experience, power in Flaxborough lasts only as long as the next scandal." "You've done wisely." When they left, Love said, "So Parkin's mixed up in fraud then? That'd explain why someone wanted to scare him." "Possibly," Purbright replied, "but fear leaves traces. There's a difference between frightening a man and nearly killing him. Whoever met him last night used bleach, not to clean, but to destroy evidence." They drove toward the Mount's residence, rain beginning again in a fine mist. But when they arrived, the gate hung open and the front door stood ajar. Love's hand went instinctively to his pocket notebook. Purbright merely sighed, as though the day had confirmed a tiresome inevitability. Inside, the house was quiet, save for the tick of a clock and the faint hum of an electric kettle boiling itself to exhaustion. Mrs. Mounts was in the parlour, sprawled on the carpet, her tea spilled beside her. She was breathing, barely. "Fetch the ambulance," Purbright said softly. Love hurried out, and Purbright knelt, examining the woman's face. Her eyes fluttered open.
"Inspector,"
she whispered.
"The book, yes? Garden shed, under—"
Her voice faltered. "He said it was only a joke." Then her eyes rolled back, and she slumped into stillness. By the time help arrived, the kettle had boiled itself dry. Purbright rose, looking around the room. The faintest whiff of something sharp lingered, bleach again. He glanced at the framed certificate on the wall. Harvest Committee, Treasurer's Award, Mrs. Edna Mounts. Outside, Love returned, shaken. "They're taking her to hospital, sir." "Doctor says she'll live." Purbright nodded absently.
"Let's look in that shed." They found it behind the house, half hidden by dahlias.
Inside, under a sack of potting soil, lay a small ledger. Purbright opened it, his expression unchanging as he read. Columns of numbers half rubbed out, re-entered in a neater hand. And between them, initials GL, CP, MT, the same triumvirate that had judged the Marrows. Love stared. "That's the Mayor Parkin and Miss Teal." "Precisely," said Purbright. "And Mrs. Mounts kept the book, which makes her the most dangerous woman in town." He closed the ledger carefully. "The wax hand, Love, it wasn't just a prank or a warning. It was a message about guilt, buried in plain sight. Someone wanted to expose the corruption but couldn't do so openly."
A woman's hand, perhaps, reminding them all who'd been handling the dirty work. Love swallowed.
"Then who attacked Parkin? The mayor? Or someone acting for him?" Purbright said. a civic partnership bound by mutual terror. He looked out at the rain-darkened garden, its flowers drooping like weary witnesses. "This little town," he murmured, "has turned harvest into confession." And as the siren in the distance drew closer, the sound seemed not so much urgent as inevitable, a hymn, perhaps, for sins best left unpruned. Rain hung over Flaxborough like a film of uncertainty, softening outlines and disguising truth. Inspector Purbright stood by the open door of Mrs. Mounce's shed, the faint smell of earth and disinfectant mingling uneasily in the damp air. The ledger lay closed in his hand, a small, unassuming thing, yet it carried the weight of every civic lie the town preferred to phrase as oversight. Sergeant Love, notebook in hand, looked as if he'd stumbled into a chapter of scripture he couldn't quite interpret. "So they were all in on it, sir?" "The Mayor, Park and Miss Teal?" "Possibly," said Purbright, "though cooperation in Flaxborough seldom lasts long enough to count as conspiracy. I'd call it mutual blackmail disguised as teamwork." Love frowned.
"And Mrs. Mounce kept the records?"
"Someone had to, Love. Committees rely on one honest person. It makes the rest of them respectable." They returned to the house as the ambulance's tail-lights faded into the fog. The doctor was just leaving, his face grim beneath the brim of his hat. "She's in no state to talk," he said. "Mild concussion, maybe from a fall, though there's a bruise on the back of her head that looks like something harder than carpet met her." Purbright inclined his head. "We'll assume she tripped over her morals until proven otherwise." The doctor gave him a puzzled look, then left. When the sound of his car vanished, Purbright turned back toward the parlour. He picked up the overturned teacup, sniffed it, and nodded slightly. "More bleach."
"Our friend's calling card?" Love exhaled. "That's the third time, sir." "Yes," Purbright said quietly.
"Flaxborough has developed a new form of communion." He carried the cup to the mantelpiece and set it down with careful precision. "Take the ledger back to the station and have it locked in the safe. No copies, no leaks. This one's written in small handwriting, but the echoes will be loud." "What about the Mayor?" Purbright's expression remained calm, but his eyes had sharpened. "The Mayor, I suspect, will be feeling suddenly nervous about his accounts." By evening, word of the attack on Mrs. Mounce had already slipped from the hospital to the High Street, acquiring flourishes along the way. By supper time, half of Flaxborough believed she had been found strangled with her own apron strings. The other half preferred poison. Neither was true, but both were satisfying. Purbright knew that gossip moved faster than guilt, and often led him there. He called at the Mayor's house shortly after 8. The residence was large, self-consciously stately, and smelled faintly of cigars and civic triumph. Mayor Lummis answered the door himself, dressed in a paisley dressing gown, and a smile that trembled at the edges. "Inspector, a pleasure, though I must say your visits are becoming alarmingly regular." "I do apologize, sir," Purbright said mildly. "I've just come from Mrs. Mounce's. She suffered quite a nasty accident." "Accident?" Lummis blinked, then recovered. "Terrible business. Flaxborough women take these things too much to heart."
"Overwork, nerves, that sort of thing." Purbright stepped inside uninvited. "And ledgers," he said.
"Those can be stressful too." The Mayor froze, then gave a laugh that was too practiced.
"Ledgers?"
"My dear fellow, you make it sound as though we're running a smuggling ring." "Only a smaller one," Purbright said.
Tell me, did you know Mrs. Mounce kept the committee accounts?"
"Of course. Entirely routine, and that she also kept copies." There was the smallest pause before Lummis said, "Well, copies? That's rather improper. Town records belong to the town." "Indeed," said Purbright. "And who better to represent it than its mayor? But I do wonder, sir, why her notes mention an unrecorded donation made last spring. £200 in cash, credited only to initials GL." The mayor's smile had retreated into his eyes, where it looked out nervously.
I'm sure that must be an error."
"She was a fine woman, but not an accountant." "No," said Purbright. "Just inconveniently precise." There was a long silence. Then the mayor sighed, almost theatrically.
Very well, Inspector.
There was a fund, a small one, used for discretionary expenses connected with the festival.
Entirely harmless, except perhaps, said Purbright, to those who knew too much about it. Lummis stiffened.
If you're implying I'd stoop to violence, I rarely imply, said Purbright. It confuses people. He took out his notepad, scribbled a few lines, and pocketed it again. Mrs. Mounts will live, fortunately, which means she'll soon be able to confirm who visited her yesterday afternoon. I wasn't anywhere near her, Lummis said quickly. I spent the day at the council offices.
Ask anyone? Oh, I shall, said Purbright, turning to leave.
And I'm sure they'll all say the same thing. Loyalty, after all, is Flaxborough's most elastic virtue. Back outside, Love was waiting by the car, a flask steaming gently in his hands. Tea, sir? Thank you. It may be the only honest brew in the borough. They drove in silence for a while, the town's windows glowing faintly through the mist, like polite secrets. Finally, Love said, if the mayor's behind it, why use bleach every time? Seems a daft choice for a weapon. Because, said Purbright, he isn't using it as a weapon. It's a symbol, his own idea of purity.
A guilty man always wants his crimes to smell of cleanliness, Love blinked.
So he's covering his tracks by scrubbing them? Precisely. The truly self-righteous criminal doesn't hide his sins, he sanitizes them. When they reached the station, Purbright paused at the gate, his gaze drifting to the shadowed spire of St. Mark's beyond the rooftops. There's one thing that bothers me, he said softly. The marrow, the ribbon, the badge, they all pointed to one mind, tidy and deliberate. But this second incident, Parkin's assault, Mrs. Mounts's injuries, it feels clumsier, frightened.
As though someone else has taken over the performance, Love frowned.
Someone cleaning up for the mayor, or someone tired of cleaning for him. Inside, the clock above the desk ticked with bureaucratic patience. Purbright sat down, wrote a short memo, and slid it into his drawer beside the envelope containing the harvest pin. His fingers rested there a moment. Love, he said without looking up, see that Mrs. Mounts's house is watched tonight, discreetly, and check on Miss Teal again in the morning. She's frightened enough to do something foolish or brave, which in Flaxborough often amounts to the same thing. Love nodded, pulling on his coat.
And you, sir? I'm going home, Purbright said.
To think about hands, wax ones, helping ones, and those that scrub too hard to stay clean. When he stepped outside, the rain had thinned to a mist. The lamps cast long reflections on the wet cobbles, turning the quiet street into a mirror of the town itself, distorted, gleaming, and uncomfortably revealing. Somewhere in the darkness, a cat yowled. Somewhere else, a door closed softly, like a secret being put away for the night. Purbright paused, listening, then walked on. In Flaxborough, he thought, sin never shouted, it whispered, politely, through the smell of bleach. The night folded itself gently around Flaxborough, muffling the drizzle and the slow tick of time. In his modest house on Lilac Terrace, Inspector Purbright sat before the small fire that had long since lost enthusiasm, its embers pulsing faintly like thoughts refusing to die. His coat hung on the back of the chair, the smell of damp wool and faint bleach still clinging to it, a scent that had begun to feel uncomfortably symbolic. On the table beside him lay three objects: the harvest badge, the torn raffia ribbon, and Mrs. Mounts's ledger, now sealed in brown paper and marked for evidence. Together they looked oddly domestic, like the contents of a drawer someone had emptied hastily before moving house. Yet, to Purbright they formed a small, stubborn constellation, the quiet geometry of deceit. He stirred his tea absently, listening to the soft hiss of rain against the window. Outside, the street was dark except for the occasional glimmer of a passing car. Flaxborough slept, or at least performed the appearance of it. Beneath its roofs and curtains, the usual nocturnal industry of guilt continued, anxieties counted like coins, secrets rehearsed and grudges nursed to comfort. Purbright's mind, patient and methodical, walked its familiar paths. He thought of the marrow, absurd and grotesque, its wax hand clutching nothing but suggestion, of Parkin's pompous indignation, Miss Teal's frightened propriety, and the mayor's performance of virtue. Each, in their own way, seemed to represent the town itself. Polished on the surface, faintly sour underneath, he wondered, not for the first time, why deception in Flaxborough always chose such modest disguises. It never dressed itself in drama or violence. Instead, it hid behind committees, invoices, and charitable gestures. Evil here was polite, meticulously filed, and signed in triplicate. He poured himself another cup of tea, the liquid a dull brown, and smiled faintly at the thought. Sergeant Love would have been scandalized to see him awake past midnight. Love believed in schedules, in the comfort of routine, in the notion that crime, and perhaps morality, kept office hours. Purbright envied him that. He leaned back, gazing at the shadows shifting across the ceiling. "Who cleans with bleach?" he murmured aloud. "Not to wash away blood, but to wash away guilt."
As if the smell itself could prove innocence. There was a rhythm to it now, a pattern too deliberate to be coincidence.
The marrow, Parkin's cider incident, Mrs. Mounce's fall, all connected by that same sterile perfume. Someone who feared exposure, yet sought redemption in neatness. Someone who believed that scrubbing the surface could absolve the stain beneath. Miss Teal came to mind. Her tidy desk, her perfectly knotted scarf, her fastidious manner. A woman who would never throw away a thing until it had been folded properly. Could she be capable of deceit, perhaps? But deceit in her hands would be symmetrical, justified, even moralized. If she had done anything, she would believe it an act of correction. Then there was the mayor, heavy, florid, practiced in his innocence. He'd always struck Purbright as a man who mistook prosperity for virtue. Yet the fear in his eyes that evening had been genuine. Not fear of justice, but of embarrassment, the sort that corrodes faster than conscience. Purbright's gaze settled again on the sealed ledger. He imagined Mrs. Mounce's careful handwriting, her quiet indignation each time the figures failed to add up. She had probably never meant to expose anyone. She had simply wanted order, like a good woman tidying a shelf that someone else kept knocking crooked. He smiled, almost sadly. In Flaxborough, good intentions were dangerous. They stirred the sediment. A log cracked in the grate, startling him from his reverie. The sound reminded him of footsteps on gravel, the kind he'd heard faintly as he left the station earlier. He rose, crossed to the window, and drew the curtain aside a fraction. Nothing moved in the narrow street except the rain. Yet the unease lingered, faint but insistent, like a half-remembered melody. He returned to his chair, his movements slower now, as if weighing invisible burdens. Perhaps he was tired, or perhaps he recognized that the story had ceased to be about ledgers and marrows. It had become a study in human housekeeping, the ways people swept their sins into corners, labeled them as virtue, and carried on. He thought again of Mrs. Mounce's whispered words. He said it was only a joke. There had been no malice in that tone, just surprise, the astonishment of someone who had glimpsed what decent people could do when frightened. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. 3 quiet raps, hesitant. He opened it to find Sergeant Love, rain dripping from his hat. "Sorry, sir," Love said. "Didn't mean to disturb you, but the hospital rang." Mrs. Mounce woke briefly, said one word before she went under again.
"And that word?" "Bookkeeper." Then she passed out. Purbright considered this. Not a name, then, a role. She's reminding us of something. Meaning herself? Possibly. Or someone who replaced her? He smiled faintly.
A woman like Mrs. Mounce wouldn't waste her last breath on autobiography. Love shifted awkwardly. You think she meant Miss Teal? Perhaps. But it's also a word that suits guilt. Everyone keeps their own accounts in the end. He dismissed the sergeant with a nod. Get some sleep, love. Tomorrow will be rather noisier than today. When the door closed, Purbright lingered by the window once more, watching the faint glow of street lamps blur in the rain. The town, he thought, was an organism of habit. It could absorb scandal the way soil absorbs water. But something had changed this time. The harvest festival, that polite ritual of gratitude, had unearthed not gratitude at all, but debt, spiritual, moral, and financial. He finished his tea, now cold, and looked again at the envelope on the table. The faintest trace of bleach clung even to that. A reminder that the guilty hand was close, too close perhaps. Close enough to tidy up behind him. When he finally went to bed, the rain had stopped, but the air still held the scent of it. Clean, uncertain and faintly deceptive, like Flaxborough itself. Morning arrived reluctantly, as if the town itself were ashamed of its own restlessness. The rain had gone, leaving behind a pale, uncertain light that made Flaxborough look momentarily innocent. Inspector Purbright, however, had ceased to believe in innocence long ago. He arrived at the station earlier than usual. Love was already there, yawning over the kettle, his expression the picture of bureaucratic fatigue. "Morning, sir. Letter for you," he said, handing over a small white envelope. "No stamp. Found it shoved through the door before I got here." Purbright examined it. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, the kind that tried not to tremble. Inside was a single sheet of notepaper, folded once. "If you want truth," it read, "ask him about the money in the choir fund." Purbright smiled faintly. "Ah, the town continues its correspondence. Anonymous virtue is still the most acted department in Flaxborough." Love frowned. "You think it's about the mayor?" "I think," said Purbright, "that gossip often knows more than guilt admits. Arrange for a choir rehearsal this afternoon, love. Somewhere civilized. The vicarage drawing-room should do. Rehearsal, sir?" "Precisely. Nothing loosens tongues like polite tea and hymnals." By 4 o'clock, the plan was in motion. Purbright had invited 3 people, Miss Teal, the mayor, and Councillor Parkin, under the genial pretext of helping the vicar select music for the upcoming Thanksgiving service. It was a scheme so disarmingly dull that none could suspect its purpose. They gathered in the vicarage parlour, where sunlight filtered through lace curtains, and the smell of furniture polish was overpowering. The vicar, who had been persuaded to play host, hovered uncertainly beside the piano, clutching a sheaf of hymn books. Miss Teal arrived first, immaculate as ever, though her composure seemed slightly strained, like porcelain too long on display. Then came Parkin, his forehead still faintly bruised, followed by the mayor, whose joviality was a shade too rehearsed. "Delightful idea, Inspector," Lummis said, settling into an armchair. "A little moral refreshment for us all." "I thought so," Purbright replied mildly. It struck me that the town might benefit from a small exercise in harmony. He waited until tea was poured, conversation politely pointless. Then, without warning, he said, "Before we begin, perhaps the Reverend might remind us of the words to all things bright and beautiful. A fitting choice for a town that values propriety." The vicar, startled, flipped open his hymn book. "Each little flower that opens," he began uncertainly. "Ah, yes," Purbright interrupted. "And each little hand that meddles, one might add." His eyes moved from one guest to the next. "A curious phrase, wouldn't you say? Little hands, like wax?" The mayor blinked, unsure whether to laugh. Miss Teal's teacup trembled slightly in its saucer. Parkin's mouth tightened. "Still," Purbright continued. Hands are useful things. They write ledgers, open tents, pour cider, even tidy, inconvenient objects into marrows. I do wonder whose hand has been most industrious of late. Parkin shifted in his seat. Inspector, this isn't the place. On the contrary, Purbright said pleasantly. We're better. The Reverend will forgive us, I'm sure. Confession, after all, began in parlours long before it found confessionals. He drew a folded paper from his pocket, the anonymous note from the morning, and laid it on the piano. This arrived today. It suggests someone among us has been reallocating funds meant for the church choir. Such a modest crime, yet so wonderfully civic. The mayor rose, flustered. I refuse to sit here and— Sit, sir, Purbright said quietly. The tone was mild, but the command within it was absolute. Lummis obeyed. Miss Teal's voice broke the silence. I know nothing about choir money, Inspector. I've never handled it. Indeed, Purbright said. But you've handled other things. Ribbons, keys, letters, even Miss Mounce's ledger, perhaps, before I found it. Her eyes widened. What are you implying? That tidiness can be a form of guilt. And yet, he said softly, you don't strike me as a woman who steals. You strike me as one who covers. She glanced involuntarily toward the mayor. Purbright caught it, as he knew he would. Lummis blustered. This is outrageous. You're accusing respectable citizens based on parlour games. Respectability, said Purbright, is a mask that fits most comfortably when no one asks questions. Unfortunately, I do. He turned to Parkin. You, Councillor, seem particularly uneasy. Perhaps Bleach disagrees with you. Parkin swallowed hard. I've already told you I was attacked. I didn't hurt anyone. Ah, but you hurt something, Purbright said, rising slowly. You hurt the illusion of trust that keeps this town glued together. You, the mayor, Miss Teal, you built your little empire of improvement on borrowed money, hidden behind civic committees and benevolent rhetoric. Mrs. Mounce found out, and then, conveniently, she fell. You called it an accident. The mayor's face reddened. You can't prove any of this. I don't need to, Purbright said. You already have. He turned his gaze to Miss Teal, whose composure was disintegrating. You see, she's been trying to put it right. The bleach, the cleaning, the ribbons, all her way of purifying what you dirtied, a woman's morality, misapplied but sincere. But the trouble with cleaning, Miss Teal, is that it leaves streaks. She stared at him, trembling. You don't understand? They promised it was temporary. Just a loan. Of course they did, Purbright said gently. The wicked always speak in the language of delay. Parkin stood abruptly. I won't sit here and be insulted by this pompous— He stopped. Miss Teal's teacup had slipped from her hand, shattering against the carpet. Her face had gone pale as paper. I didn't mean to hurt her, she whispered. Mrs. Mounce only wanted to give it back to the church. I thought if I frightened Parkin, if I showed him what he'd done, he'd stop. The mayor groaned softly and covered his face. The vicar dropped his hymn book. Purbright nodded, calm and almost kind. And so the wax hand was your sermon, a reminder of judgment. She fainted when I pushed her, Miss Teal said, voice breaking. I thought she was dead. I used the bleach. I thought it would wash everything clean. Purbright looked at her, not unkindly. In Flaxborough, Miss Teal, even redemption must fill in a requisition form. He signalled to Love, who stepped forward quietly from the doorway, notebook in hand. The inspector turned back to the group, his voice calm again. Thank you all. I believe the hymn practice has served its purpose. We shall resume the investigation at the station. As they filed out, Purbright lingered a moment by the window, watching the pale light fade over the vicarage garden. The flowers, washed by rain, looked newly bright, though he knew it was only an illusion. Clean things, he thought, were often the dirtiest of all. By the following morning, Flaxborough had recovered its usual poise, outwardly at least. The church bells rang for matins, the postman whistled, and the town resumed its studied normality, as though the marrow, the bleach, and the broken teacup had all been part of a mildly regrettable dream. Only Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love knew that by evening there would be no dream left to hide behind. Purbright had arranged for a meeting of clarification at the mayor's house, a phrase calculated to sound harmless. Love had set out the chairs and poured the sherry. Miss Teal sat in one corner, pale and neat, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that the knuckles shone white. Councillor Parkin occupied another, his habitual self-importance reduced now to a faint, defensive twitch. The mayor himself stood by the mantelpiece, one hand on the silver-framed photograph of his late wife, as though drawing moral reinforcement from her absence. When Purbright entered, he closed the door softly behind him, glanced once at each of them and said simply, "I believe we can conclude matters now," Lummis blustered.
"I do hope this farce won't drag on any longer, Inspector."
"The council is beginning to—" Purbright raised a hand, and the mayor's voice withered. "We'll be brief, sir. I dislike melodrama as much as you do." He took a small folder from under his arm and laid it on the side table. "This contains a full account of the misappropriations from the harvest and choir funds, together totalling £837. Modest but significant. The signatures in the ledger, though tampered with, are yours, Councillor Parkin's, and Miss Teal's." Parkin shifted. "We borrowed it, temporarily, to cover the festival's shortfall." "Everyone agreed." "Everyone," Purbright interrupted mildly, "being the three of you. Mrs. Mounts, as treasurer, objected. So the entry for the anonymous donation was invented to balance the books."
"Unfortunately for you, she kept her own copy." Lummis turned red.
"A technical irregularity, perhaps, but hardly criminal." Purbright's voice remained calm. "If it had ended there, no one would have noticed."
But then came the harvest festival, and Miss Teal's conscience began to sprout. He turned to her, not unkindly.
"You tried to frighten them, didn't you? The wax hand, the message inside the marrow, it was meant for Parkin. A warning, not harm." "You wanted him to confess." Miss Teal nodded faintly, eyes lowered.
"I thought if he realized people suspected,
he'd stop."
"I didn't mean for it to go so far." Parkin gave a bitter laugh.
"The woman's mad. Wax hands, ribbons. It's absurd." "Not absurd," Purbright said. "Symbolic. You see, the wax hand wasn't random. It was the right hand, Parkin's helping hand, as he called it, when he arranged the accounts. Miss Teal wanted him to see himself reflected grotesquely, but he didn't, so she tried again. He opened another envelope and drew out a small glass vial. "Bleach," he said simply, "found in the cider tent. Your handiwork, Miss Teal. You used it to scrub the wax residue from the marrow's skin. You always cleaned up after others." Her voice trembled. "I thought if I erased the proof it would stop spreading."
"I never meant to hurt anyone." Purbright's gaze softened.
"But then Mrs. Mounts found the ledger. You went to see her. She confronted you, and you pushed her. Not in anger, but panic. You believed you'd killed her. You tried to wash the scene, to make it pure again."
"Only guilt, Miss Teal, stains deeper than dirt." Parkin leaned forward, voice sharp.
"If she's admitting to assault, that clears the rest of us. The mayor and I had nothing to do with that." Purbright shook his head. "On the contrary, you gave her reason. You and the mayor exploited her scruples until they broke her. Your so-called loan was no temporary matter. You'd siphoned public funds for years, small amounts, carefully dispersed among civic projects. It took the harvest accounts to expose it. When Miss Teal began to suspect, you pressed her to remain quiet. And when Mrs. Mounts threatened to go to the press, you told Miss Teal she must handle it." Lummis spluttered.
We never said such a thing."
"No," Purbright agreed. "You implied it. You relied on her decency, knowing she'd interpret silence as duty. That's the oldest form of coercion, Mayor. It leaves no fingerprints." The room was very quiet, Outside, the faint sound of a milk cart clattered down the lane, a domestic noise at odds with the tension within. Purbright went on, his tone almost reflective.
The bleach was your undoing.
You all used it, Miss Teal to clean, Parkin to conceal, and you, Mayor, to symbolize virtue. When we found the same smell in 3 different places, the tent, the cider shed, and Mrs. Mounce's parlour, it wasn't chemistry that linked them. It was morality, the kind that polishes guilt until it shines. Miss Teal began to cry softly, the sound small and hopeless. Purbright waited until it subsided, then said gently, Mrs. Mounce has regained consciousness. She'll recover. She remembers what happened, though she blames herself for provoking you. She even asked me to tell you that she forgives you.
I mention this not to absolve you,
Miss Teal, but to remind you that in Flaxborough, forgiveness often arrives in envelopes marked private. He turned back to the Mayor and Parkin, who were staring at the carpet. As for you two, you'll find your influence has run its course. The town prefers its scandals tidy, and this one, fortunately, will allow for neat bookkeeping. You'll resign quietly, no doubt citing health. The Mayor's voice was barely audible. And you, Inspector?
What will you write in your report?
Only the truth, Purbright said. That decency, once weaponized, can become as corrupting as greed. He gathered the documents, closed his folder, and nodded to Love, who stepped forward with a discreet firmness that belonged to long practice. If you'd all be so good as to accompany us, the sergeant said softly. They went one by one, the Mayor first, still clutching his dignity like a damp handkerchief. Then Parkin, muttering about legal representation. And finally, Miss Teal, silent, eyes fixed on some private horizon of shame. When the door closed, Purbright remained standing for a long moment, looking at the empty room. The silver photograph of the Mayor's wife still gleamed on the mantelpiece, gazing out serenely over the wreckage of respectability. Love returned after escorting them. It's over then, he said quietly. Purbright smiled faintly. In Flaxborough, Love, it's never over. It's merely filed. He walked to the window, watching the clouds part over the church spire. The town looked peaceful again, tidy, cleansed. But he knew better. Beneath every whitewashed surface, the same old stains waited patiently for their next season. He turned away, reached for his hat, and said, Come along, Love, let's get back to the station. There's always paperwork after a confession, and outside, as the church bells began to ring for evening service, Flaxborough, ever pious,
ever forgetful, prepared
to forgive itself once more. The scandal of the harvest.
Murders, though Flaxborough never called it that in
public, faded from conversation, with the tidy speed of something both embarrassing and inevitable. By the next week, the council issued a statement, regretting recent administrative irregularities, and the Flaxborough Citizen printed an editorial that managed to condemn wrongdoing while praising the town's essential moral fibre. The Mayor resigned for health reasons. Councillor Parkin withdrew to his brother's farm near Sleaford to recover from strain. Miss Teal was receiving treatment for exhaustion. No one mentioned bleach. Inspector Purbright, for his part,
had no taste for public triumph.
He preferred the paperwork, the quiet satisfaction of setting things in order. On a drizzly Thursday morning, he sat at his desk in the police station, writing his final report. The typewriter clacked softly, rhythmic and calm, like a clock that had learned to keep its own secrets. Sergeant Love entered, carrying 2 cups of tea and the air of someone trying not to look pleased. "Morning, sir. Looks like the town's gone back to normal." "Normal," Purbright repeated, signing his name. A condition Flaxborough treats much as the church treats virtue, more admired than practiced. Love grinned faintly. "Still no one's trying to kill anyone this week."
"That's progress." "Not quite," said Purbright.
"They're simply using manners again." He placed the completed file into a buff envelope, marked Case Concluded. "When decency returns to Flaxborough, Love, It always brings a broom." A moment's silence followed, filled only by the faint hum of the office clock. Love hesitated. "Do you ever feel sorry for them, sir? Miss Teal, I mean."
She didn't seem bad, just wrong-headed. Purbright leaned back, his expression softening.
"Pity is a poor substitute for understanding." She wanted to make something clean.
Instead, she proved that virtue, like bleach, burns if overused.
Love nodded, not entirely understanding, but sensing the point. "Still, the town's lucky to have you keeping an eye on it." "Luck," said Purbright, "has nothing to do with it. I simply arrive after everyone else has stopped pretending." Outside, the square looked much as it always had. Buses grinding past the war memorial, shop windows displaying their unchanging wares, and a faint smell of cabbage drifting from somewhere unacknowledged. The harvest banners had been taken down, leaving faint rust marks where they'd hung. Flaxborough's conscience, like its lampposts, was polished only when visitors were expected. By noon, the mayor's replacement, a timid solicitor named Cargill, had taken the oath of office. The ceremony was brief, attended mostly by people hoping for sandwiches. Purbright stood discreetly at the back, hands folded behind him, watching the new man stammer through his promises. When it was done, he congratulated him politely. Cargill flushed. "I hope to restore public trust, Inspector." "The town deserves a fresh start." Purbright's eyes twinkled faintly. "Indeed, though in Flaxborough, fresh usually means recently rearranged." As he left the hall, he passed Mrs. Glossop and Mrs. Vole in conversation near the door. They were already rewriting history between them. "I said from the very first," Mrs. Glossop declared, "that poor Miss Teal was overworked. Always so conscientious. It's the sensitive ones that suffer most." Mrs. Vole nodded sagely. "Still, one must admire the mayor's courage. To step down before being asked, that's true leadership." Purbright walked past them without comment. He'd learned that in Flaxborough, gossip aged faster than milk, but lasted longer than stone. Later that afternoon, he strolled by the river, where the last of the festival litter still clung to the reeds. Programs,
Sandwich wrappers, a child's lost rosette.
The air smelled of damp earth and quiet relief. On the opposite bank, a gardener was burning the remnants of the marrow tent canvas. The smoke rose in pale ribbons, twisting into the grey sky like the town's version of absolution. He stopped at the railing, watching the slow movement of the water. There was something reassuring in its indifference. No matter how much people lied, schemed, or confessed, the river kept its rhythm, carrying away whatever the town no longer wished to see. Love joined him after a moment, hands in pockets. "Looks peaceful again," he said. "It always does afterward," Purbright replied. Flaxborough never resists the temptation of calm."
It mistakes it for goodness. Do you think they've learned anything?
Purbright considered. "Learning implies memory. The town will forget by next harvest. They'll plant, judge, gossip, and cheat as before. That's what passes for faith here, the belief that repetition is redemption." Love looked puzzled.
"And you don't mind?"
Purbright smiled faintly. "Not at all. It keeps me in work." They walked back through the market square, where the stalls were closing for the day. The shopkeepers greeted them politely, as though the events of the past fortnight had been an unfortunate misunderstanding best left unmentioned. A few offered vegetables on the house, which Purbright declined with equal civility. At the corner, he paused and looked up. The church clock, newly cleaned, gleamed in the wan sunlight. Its hands, like everything else in Flaxborough, moved with impeccable decorum, slowly, inevitably, and without reflection. When they reached the station, Purbright handed the case file to the clerk. "For the archives," he said. "Label it under miscellaneous harvest incidents." The clerk raised an eyebrow.
"Not attempted murder?"
Purbright smiled. "Too specific. The town prefers its sins generalized." He went into his office, removed his hat, and settled behind the desk. For a moment he sat still, listening to the low murmur of voices from the outer room, the faint rattle of typewriter keys, the comfortable monotony of small-town justice continuing its modest routine. On the windowsill, a vase of wilted chrysanthemums left by some well-meaning clerk tilted toward the light. Purbright regarded them with a mixture of amusement and affection. Even dying flowers, he thought, had the decency to look decorative in Flaxborough. He picked up his pen, opened a fresh report form, and began to write. Subject: concluded matter concerning irregularities in local civic accounts. Observations: the moral landscape remains fertile for repetition. Recommend no further interference at present. He signed his name, blotted the page carefully, and sat back, eyes half closed. Outside, the church bell struck 5. Its sound rolled gently over the rooftops, blending with the faint rumble of distant trains. The town, as ever, went on, and Inspector Purbright, who knew better than to expect reform from the English soul, merely smiled and reached for another sheet of paper.